Excellence, Mr. Ambassador, dear panelists, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ulrich Hauschild. I'm music director here at the Palais des Beaux-Arts, and it is a pleasure and honor to welcome you here in the Center for Fine Arts in Brussels for the first debate we organize together with the Cultural Action Europe. And I would like to thank the Cultural Action Europe team and especially Secretary General Luca Bergamo for all their work and their support for this evening. This debate is the first in a series we propose to the audience every 6 months, linked to the presidencies of the European Council. With this debate, as a part of BOZAR Agora, we would like to offer a space for more exchange and new reflections on the society. We wish to take a look at Europe and its challenges through art and culture. This debate is meant to bring together a variety of perspectives in terms of disciplines and experiences, but also from many geographic areas. I'm very pleased that we can exchange views with participants from Greece, from the Netherlands, the UK, and Italy tonight. The role of creation in times of turbulences, today's topic, takes place in the context of the Greek presidency and is directly linked to the exhibition No Country for Young Men, focusing on contemporary Greek artists in times of crisis. Create art means asking questions. In all periods of mankind, artists have asked the same questions around love and death, isolation, friendship, individuality, community, identity, spiritualism, or dependence and independence. Creating art will confront us emotionally with theater, opera, music, literature, visual arts, and architecture. Creating art is the mirror of our society. Artists are visionary, but without creating a repertoire of contemporary art, we cannot develop the tradition into the future. The debate over the political function of art is particularly intense at the moment. Art should attract our attention, make us curious about our desires, create hope and visions, and unmask violence, fraud, and intrigue. To achieve this, artists are always outsiders who bring to the surface the unusual, the exciting, and the very special. Artists must live with the fact that those in power may deprive them from their favor, dictators may burn their books, and the audience that adores them may forget them. My strong advice for those who have such responsibilities: listen to the artists. They are always ahead of time. Trust them. I wish you a very emotional and very inspiring debate. And Mr. Bergamo will introduce some words.
My name is Luca Bergamo. I'm the Secretary General of Cultural Action Europe, which is, for those that do not know it, the umbrella organization of the cultural sector at European level. We members over 115 networks, European, giving voice to 80,000 cultural organizations. I want to welcome you to these things that we consider to be the lab for us. We are trying to understand how discussions around the role that culture plays in society in this time in Europe can be, let's say, put in place so to achieve an evolution of the debate. That's why we decided for a very unconventional format, for inviting Claire as a moderator and provoker of this debate, so I don't know if the moderator word applies to her story and background. That's why we invited the guests, which are people that, through their own experiences, by very different angle, they've been both exerting powers, which is the powers to convey, the powers to manage, the powers to structure, but then reading the society they are in. And they've changed role in their life, so they've been living different time, so that things that this discussion can really contribute to, brick by brick, modify the framework in which the reflection over the role that culture plays in society occurs. Why we do that? Because we are profoundly convinced that the way for Europe to play any possible role in the world to come is to acknowledge that what on which Europe's wealth was based no longer exists. There's no demography, there's no central power in the world. The size of national states, it doesn't apply to the world situation. So we consider that this specific time of European life not to be a crisis out of which we will go back to ordinary business. This is a period in transition where we need to understand what assets we have to build what. And what we think we can build in Europe is, or see Europe as a cradle of society based on sustainability and fulfillment of human rights for current and future generations. In this, the development of the cultural capacity of people is a core issue, while in the politics is completely absent. We are doing this work broadly through very different means. I don't even expect that we will achieve individually, but I expect that we will be able, together with us, by paving the way for those to come to really live different future in this content. Claire, which I'm handing over the floor here, is a thinker. Has been a radical thinker. Is a radical thinker. I think that we will disagree on several points. She may disagree with the panelists, but what we wanted here, and I'm very thankful for them, it's to have a free discussion which is not within the constraint of the classical discussion that we have on these things. So we're going to play with Claire, that's going to introduce our points of view, give the floor to the speakers, have a conversation, then open the conversation to you, and we really encourage you to step in, but stepping in a conversation. So imagine that is not an ego exercise, but in an attempt of making a discussion. Thank you very much for coming and to be part of this experiment, which is one of the several that we are undertaking in this period. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for inviting me to moderate this and to start off by making a provocation statement. I think in the sense that it's an experiment, asking me to do this provocation is probably the more risky experimental part of it. So we'll see how we go. We'll see how we go. But I really liked the idea and the setup, and I think it's invaluable to have an open conversation that doesn't just pat itself on the back for having the right opinions. And the idea is that we have a genuinely free and frank conversation, both about Europe in these turbulent and transitional times, as well as the role of the arts and culture in relation to that. Okay, so I'm going to set the scene, and I'm also then going to very much try and get a lively discussion up here that then opens up to you fairly quickly. But let me, first of all, start with noting that even in Britain, I have a very peculiar accent. So I am going to be aware of the fact that I hope that you will understand me. But I'll also say, in typical British fashion, my pronunciation of anything that isn't English is so atrocious that I have to make an apology before I start, and nobody please take offence at that. You'll be right to be provoked and offended by some of my views, but on my pronunciation it's just a weakness. As was explained, I'm Claire Fox. I'm the director of the UK's Institute of Ideas, which is based in London. But we try and organise public discussions and conversations and debates that shake up orthodoxy and attempt to, I suppose, enrich intellectual life, political life with a small p. And I'm not an artist. I'm a political commentator, a cultural commentator, as well as an organiser of these kind of public debates and discussions. And one of the things that we're organising, which is pertinent to this evening, but also helps me lay out, maybe nail my colours to the mast, is that tomorrow evening we're organising a debate in Athens at the Free Speaking Zone. Some of my colleagues will be there, and we're actually looking at whether the EU is compatible with freedom and democracy, and having that discussion with people there. And, you know, if you think about the forthcoming elections, to just do the kind of politics bit and context, you know, in a few weeks' time, 500 million people in 28 countries will have the right to vote in the European elections, elect 751 MEPs. And it seems, in a way, like such a fantastic exercise of democracy that there should be some celebration in relation to it. But I think we do have to query whether the EU really is the embodiment of democracy before we even start. How will the election benefit the citizens of Europe? After all, the real power lies with the member states in the Council, with the bureaucrats in the European Commission, rather than in the European Parliament. And for countries like Greece and Ireland and Portugal and Spain and Cyprus, they've all had to negotiate economic bailout deals with Troika officials really over the heads of or behind the backs of the voters in their countries. And they have been, in many ways, excluded. There's constant regulations written and decided by technocrats trying to regulate different aspects of our lives, which we have no say in. And I, you know, have thought about this in relation to the exhibition, that this is a debate not about the exhibition, but inspired by the exhibition, No Country for Young Men, which I've just been able to see, but which have been reading the programme and so on. And thinking about how art reflects on some of these tricky questions. It's possibly because I'm from an Irish background that I feel this democratic deficit particularly strongly, because if you'll remember, the people of Ireland at some point had a referendum, a democratic referendum, and voted against the Treaty of Lisbon. And they were told to go back and try again until they came back with the right answer. And I think that any discussion on Europe, whether it's about the arts in Europe or about our visions of Europe moving forward, cannot but remember that there is a tension between the EU as an elite project and the democratic, you know, autonomy of ordinary people in the European regions. So you might gather that I am effectively pro-European. This is interesting. Whenever I say that I'm anti-EU outside of Britain, people say, oh, that's because you're British. And they assume that I'm some little Englander, a kind of xenophobe who doesn't like foreigners. To assure you, although I don't want to be defensive, I'm actually an open borders person, see myself as very European, but I do believe in the nation state and national sovereignty, because that's where I can hold people to account. It gives me the power as the demos. And I'm also very wary of the EU as anything other than a top-down imposed set of arrangements, which I'm nervous about. But nonetheless, I think that regardless of where you stand on the politics there, you can see that there's some room for argument and debate. And I mention that because I think sometimes when we have a discussion about the arts and culture, there are times when it's assumed that all artists will fit into a ready-made narrative of what Europe is and will help fight against all those nasty populists who are anti-EU, like me. Sometimes populism is used to describe the will of the people, not our kind of people, you understand, but I think that that can be a disdainful scorn that actually is also reflects a certain anti-democratic trend. I also thought I'd share with you something, so I now want to kind of more talk about the role of the arts in a period like today. You may be surprised to know, and it's not very well known actually in Britain, that 2014 is the UK-Russia Year of Culture. And this was proclaimed in great press releases in November last year, rather ill-timed as you can imagine, that says that this is all about fostering cultural exchange and the flow of ideas whilst developing stronger relations between the peoples, the institutions, and the governments. And the arguments put forward for it was that culture and the arts could uniquely bring people together and build bridges and sow seeds of understanding. And from the press release again, it said, to help cement the important cultural relations in combating barriers and combating the misunderstanding between nations. I want to query whether that is fair, a fair thing to ask the arts to do, whether it demands too much of the arts. And it's obviously made all the more challenging in the present circumstances. It is quite also funny, by the way, that whereas Britain was getting this wonderful exhibition by Malevich and various different symphony orchestras coming over, we were giving them Designing 007 50 Years of Bond Style, which says so much about British diplomacy. It's frightening. Never mind the state of British art. We threw a bit of Shakespeare in, so that's okay. But I think we were probably getting the better deal. But anyway, I think that the deeper question that pertains to this evening's discussion really is there a danger, for example, in that instance, of asking the arts to be an extension of the Foreign Office or to do diplomacy? I'm not sure that art ever actually should be diplomatic. That's probably the last thing that you would want. But I think that there has been certainly some pressure over recent years, certainly in Britain, and I know it's beyond Britain, to use the arts as an instrument of politics, not to appreciate the arts in their own terms, but to constantly demand that they resolve social and political problems. And that's something that I would like to raise as a problem in many ways. And obviously the UK-Russia exchange in light of Ukraine and Crimea would indicate that sometimes it's a waste of time as well. But can culture reach the parts that diplomacy or politics cannot reach is a good question. Is it too much of a burden, as I've suggested, too much of a responsibility on art, which after all has at least can have huge degrees of ambivalence and ambiguity and so on. It can't always deliver the right message. You know, when opening the National Gallery in London in the 19th century, the politician Sir Robert Peel, this was in London, told Parliament, the exacerbation of angry and unsocial feelings might be much softened by the effects which the fine arts had ever produced upon the minds of men. And this was an attempt at using the arts to quell rebellion, to stop them rioting, and it obviously didn't work. It had the side advantage, which was that people got to see great art. There's a scheme in London all around tube stations, the underground stations, where they play classical music. you'd think this might be a great cultural enthusiasm for introducing the people of London to classical music. No, they play it because they think it will put young people off going into tube stations and stop them hanging around. Again, there's been a very positive side to this, which is that everybody who works on the London Underground is now familiar with Wagner, Verdi and so on, and you get all these kind of workers singing along. But it was done in such bad faith, and you can see the dangers, I hope, of the dangers of potentially at least asking arts to do these kind of instrumental social jobs. The Irish poet and playwright Brendan Behan, when asked once what his play The Hostage was about, what was its message, he said to have replied, "Message? What the hell do you think I am? A bloody postman?" And then advised that if you wanted instructions, you should read a manifesto or go to a meeting. And so I think that we're all aware that even though artists should reflect and will reflect the political times, that there's always a thin line with political art when it's self-consciously political art, that it turns into agitprop, or that it's expected to deliver the right message as dictated by the powers that be. So of course I believe that arts reflect and respond to, inevitably, the political mood of the period. And, you know, one only has to think of Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People, or Diego Rivera's Revolutionary Murals, Picasso's Guernica, to know that I'm not trying to be crass about saying that great art and reflecting the political world can never match at all. I think that's really true. It's obviously true historically that the fine, sensitive minds of artists can sometimes show us forevermore and capture the temperament of the time. But I'm also reminded of a debate that I did some years ago, which I was asked to speak at the Tate Britain, which was Mark Walliger's State Britain exhibition, which I don't know if people are familiar with, which was where Mark Wallinger, the artist, recreated an anti-war protest installation from an anti-Iraq war installation, using the exact placards and pictures that had been used in an anti-war protest outside of the Parliament at Westminster. You know, there was great enthusiasm and excitement for this exhibition. People, you know, one journalist described it as the equivalent of Goya's 3rd of May, which I thought was, you know, Manet's execution of the Emperor Maximilian. But actually, when you went to it, it was a load of placards and pictures and flags. And by the way, which expressed some rather banal political insights, like George Bush is a murderer, you know, no war, food, not bombs. And it was very difficult to know, and this is another thing I'd like to pose to you as a problem, is how do I hold this account? As art or as politics, or what does it mean? Is it really art? I mean, I know I don't want to get into the overly existential is it art question, but I just didn't feel satisfied that it was anything other than aping a rather lazy, cliched political period that we live in. Because let's be honest, sometimes I feel that some of the opposition movements today, like the youthful Occupy movement, are overly shrill, overly superficial, and lack depth. And I would want at least art to not necessarily just reflect them. And if they are going to reflect the politics of our day, if politics are so empty and disengaged, is that really problematic? My final thing, I think, to say before I introduce my speakers is just a sort of a word of caution about how we think of the opposition. Because one of the things that I find in political debates is there's an assumption that we all agree that we are the right kind of liberal-minded people who are all be on one progressive side, and then there's these kind of like unruly people over there. Because, you know, when we actually say, you know, we expect the arts to be radical, for example, we all assume that the radicalism is is the radicalism we think is the right radicalism. You know, they're all anti-racist, everybody's a feminist, everybody's anti-homophobic, of course. Everybody thinks that Golden Dawn and UKIP and the National Front in France are all evil people. You know, we are the opposition that counts because we are into human rights and all the rest of it. Now, I would point out that this is an act of incredible self-flattery and complacent laziness that doesn't do any of us any good. And patting ourselves on the back for having the right answers isn't going to actually help art liven itself up or be interesting or nuanced, and it certainly won't do much good for politics either. You know, at the moment, there's this organisation called UKIP in the United Kingdom, United Kingdom Independence Party, that's going to do very well in the EU elections, probably. And so the Prime Minister, David Cameron, says that its supporters are fruitcakes, loonies, and closet racists. And there's a kind of argument that goes on that they're all bigots, xenophobic simpletons, prejudiced idiots. You know, that they just aren't getting the message. They can't understand the kind of cosmopolitan elite. And I think that the reason I raise that is because I think that we have to be very careful that we don't adopt that posture, and that we maybe should ask deeper questions about why these parties are attracting people without immediately writing everyone off as a racist or immediately assuming we all agree with each other. Because one of the things I thought was interesting in relation to the way that the exhibition was described, for example, was, I can't find the quote now, but anyway, which was that the exhibition by the Greek artists, but you know, the artists can give us visions of the future, right? Give us a vision of the future, can help unite Europe in these fractured times, can really move forward with a vision. But the thing I'd say is that whose vision? I mean, which vision? I mean, the job of politics is competing visions, right? We can't assume we've all got the same vision. And what happens if the artist doesn't have the same vision as another artist? Do we think that art is no good because they don't fit into the kind of political narrative that we're all assumed to agree with? And anyway, I don't vote for artists, right? I mean, I don't necessarily want them to decide what my future is. No disrespect to any of you in the room. But, you know, art, stick to it. I mean, politics, I'm good at, right? Art, I don't necessarily, I've got a huge amount of respect for artists, but I don't necessarily think they're the most astute political thinkers dealing with the complexities of today if they're going to determine the future. My hope is that this evening that I've at least introduced a few sceptical points, so that when we have this discussion, because I'm actually obviously interested in looking at how the arts and culture relate to this period, whether we are in danger of threatening the autonomy of the artist as a free creator by making too much political demands on the artist, or whether we actually think that an artist who is indifferent to the turbulent times that we live in is really just kind of self-indulgent. I think it's a reasonable question because, you know, there's nothing worse than, you know, meeting up with people who say, crisis, what crisis? I haven't noticed austerity or unemployment either. So what is our balance? But that's it's just some thoughts to be getting on with. Now, what I've asked the speakers to do, and I'm now going to introduce them, is just to give me an opening thought, really, either to what I've said or some questions I've sent them in advance or anything they want, really, just to kind of get a statement out there. And then we'll kind of have a conversation, possibly a row. And then we'll kind of open it up. I mean, that's where we're at. Right, so our speakers. So we have Giovanna Melandri, I'm concentrating on pronunciation, who's president of the Fondazione MAXXI, the Italian National Centre for Contemporary Art, Architecture and Design, and has been since 2012, and is currently founder and chairwoman of the Uman Foundation, working for venture philanthropy and social finance, and has since June 2013 been a member of the G8 task force for social investment chaired by Sir Ronald Cohen. Giovanna was a member of the Italian Parliament for 18 years and held positions between 1994 and 2012, where she held positions as Minister of Culture and Minister for Youth and Sport. She has a degree in economics from the University of Rome, an honorary degree from John Cabot American Union University in Rome, and has been awarded the Officer de la Légion d'honneur by the President of the French Republic, Jacques Chirac. Can we give Giovanna a warm welcome, please? And then we'll be hearing from, one of our other guests is Katherine Watson, who is the director of ECF, has been since 2009, was formerly the director of ECF's online project, Lab for Culture. She's currently vice chair of the European Foundation Centre, in which the ECF plays an active role. Her international experience on both sides of the Atlantic combines interdisciplinary art productions with advocacy research policy and programmes developed for non-profit arts organisations as well as governments. She's been a producer, a director, a manager, a fund developer, an arts advisor, a jury member and chair of several boards, and has particular interest in investigating how the digital shift has affected our society, something I'm also interested in, and the intersection of art and culture with other fields of endeavour. Can we give her a warm welcome, please? And last but not least, we have Antonis Pittas, who is an artist. He lives and works in Amsterdam. As an artist, he mainly creates context-sensitive spatial installations and is part of the exhibition. Those spatial installations are informed by architecture, art historical references, performative aspects of installation arts and its social dynamics. A majority of his projects come from into existence over a long period of time, and he always in relation to particular sites or contexts. He's had recent solo exhibitions, including a retrospective at Hassel Museum of Art and CCS Galleries at Bard College, New York, land art at Benaki Museum, Athens, a show at the Annette, Gallery in Amsterdam, which represents him, so that's quite important, so you can tell us in a minute. At the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, Smart Project Space in Amsterdam. He's also a guest teacher at the Danish Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Copenhagen and at the Sandberg Institute in Amsterdam. Can we give him a warm welcome, please? I think that actually the organisers have done really well at people who are involved in all different aspects of thinking about the arts over in different ways. So I think I'm looking forward to the discussion. Katherine, can I start with you? Katherine, any thoughts? Give us a few minutes worth.
Certainly nothing if it's not provocative, what you've said. And I think a starting point I would like to is to say art and culture or artists, we shouldn't be thinking of that in a block, as we don't like to think about anything else in a block. So your statements about how art might be instrumentalized or politicized, and the nature of the kind of examples you had kind of identifies it as one thing. And I would like to maybe just reflect on another side of it, because it's not so much, I think, talking about instrumentalization, which is not a conversation I particularly like. It's about participation, and it's about actually individuals, regardless of being an artist or defined in another way, being engaged in their communities, engaged in their society. And if we look at this overall thematic or title for this evening, it was to consider turbulent times. And of course, turbulence again varies from a kind of general sense of perhaps unease or in face of the unsettling feeling of change, which can be, it is turbulent, but at the same token we have the full range that goes to catastrophe and violence and loss of life and family and disruption of communities and so on. So the turbulence that way is I think, affecting a frame that affects us all. And then within that frame, there are moments in time, there are particular places where an enormous boulder falls into a pool of water, and the ripples out of that touch everyone. And for me, you start to think how people reflect or how that does touch them, and then how those who are living, if we could call it, at the epicenter of where that had dropped, how all of the people in that context, but then we're talking specifically about the artists and how they engage or don't engage, or interact or don't interact. And it makes me consider, and also from our perspective as a foundation who is on the one side financially supporting artists, art projects, things going on in communities, and on the other side engaging in the advocacy around the role that culture has and the role that culture can play, and if I could hesitate to say should play, and is being played by many artists. And in considering that, in the last over a period of a few days, a few things crossed my desk, and one was an article from the New York Times, a fairly recent article that was headed "Artist Soldier On," a metaphor which is horrible, but it was discussing or presenting what was happening in various Ukrainian cities and the artists who were involved. And while on the one side feeling very proud, and the other just raising that awareness, two of the artists that were quoted were artists that our foundation had supported in exchange programs. And one of them works in a museum, and he and other colleagues were, it's interesting reflection on your Tate example, they were collecting some of the ephemera, some of the living memories from the Maidan, because no one else was doing it. And his quote, which is I think quite is worth requoting. He said, and he is from the Ivan Honchar Museum, so his name is Ihor Poshivialo, and he says, mostly museums are about the past, but now we have a chance to fix the history of today. So deciding as an artist and as working in a cultural organization in a very turbulent situation, one of those huge boulders that has fallen, actively engaging, and not only engaging in the art practice, but actively engaging in the politics. And going back to your opening statement, this is the small p politics. This is our everyday democracy, which is to a large degree failing us everywhere, and is certainly failing in these more extreme situations. Or another example was Katerina Botanova, who's director of the Kiev Foundation Center for Contemporary Art. And she said, it's the politicians, not the artists, who are playing up Ukraine's divisions. So the sense that the artist is not in service of the politician, but recognizing the failings that the politicians have, and that the people need to be much more engaged with that. Or at the same day, I believe, an email in from a colleague in Egypt who was seeking support of the release of a young visual artist, Sharif Farak, who had been imprisoned in Cairo since November. Another artist who had worked in a project that we had been supporting, or an exchange between Latvia and Egypt. So these became very personal, very specific, and seeing, as I could say, the artist right in the middle of the fray, so not necessarily creating an art piece reflecting on, and there's also a huge role for that, but actively engaged in the turbulence, in the conflict, in the protest, but also seeing so many artists and organizations working with others in their community. So it's not solely the cultural sector, absolutely not. But we're looking at how you move beyond those protest situations. So how do you, I would say there are many that you characterize the Occupy movements and as possibly rather shallow, not having a strong political footing, certainly not having leadership and so on. Well, there are those who have been part of those political engagements, part of those protests, who are now working actively in their communities alongside authorities to try and make change in the communities. The cultural centers that we've worked with in Egypt that became the only safe places for people to gather in. And this is an engagement, not an instrumentalization. So I think, just in wrapping, that this urgency, emergency, and crisis, it pushes many people to act differently, to take responsibility differently. If I turn it around to myself and our organization, it raises to me a big question: how do we change? What do we do to support that kind of action, that kind of engagement?
Okay, great. You've raised. Sorry. No.
Oh, I need that. It's mine.
You raised loads of interesting things which we'll come back to get the discussion going. But for now, just Giovanna, your just opening thoughts for now.
Well, okay. I'll try and be very critical with what I heard. First of all, let me say that I want to react to the political introduction, because I see that very de-linked with our discussion over arts. And I want to react to your opinion, to your views on Europe, on democracy, and on the institutional building process. I'm not in politics anymore, which makes me feel very well, very happy. But I was in politics for many years, and I always detested any public discourse that started talking about the politicians, okay? As you said, there are no politicians, there are visions, political visions. And if we talk about Europe, which is definitely very imperfect. It's definitely very far away from being the perfect democracy. We have to talk about the visions that were embedded in the process of the institutional shaping that made it so. So some of these visions have just taken the role, and it was the austerity rule. You mentioned the word once at the end of your speech, which I thought was quite unjust, because if we talk about the EU as not being the compatible with democracy, and I don't think so. I think it is compatible, but I think it's very imperfect, and we definitely need to reshape it. Then we have to understand what has happened in the process of shaping this institution. And I think that what has happened was that I don't want to make a political speech because I do want to talk about the arts, but I think that what has happened was that the austerity ruled, the accumulation ruled, and I think that when you ask yourself, I mean, I want to ask you, are you really sure that the nation state is where you can hold people to account? I mean, look at what happened in the financial markets. They slipped away totally from regulation. And that's where the austerity reaction, the reactionary austerity reaction took place. So I personally agree with you with the fact that I don't want to sort of self-flatter progressive thinking. I'm very well aware that progressive thinking has sort of failed. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had this Europe. But this Europe is not the Europe that I want. And I don't think, and this is another point before talking about arts, and I don't think that that the populist, yes, I agree. Sometimes we talk about populism and we don't look within it. We don't look at what the motivations are behind it. But I don't think that it's either populism or this Europe. There's another vision, and we need to have that vision grow. Okay, said that. what is the role of an institution like MAXXI? I want to talk about what we're doing, because I think this is the best way to sort of say something which, you know, can be accountable for. I think that in the process of reshaping institutions on all levels, you know, European, national, local levels, there's also a role for reshaping cultural institutions. And I don't see, I mean, I don't know how many of you know what MAXXI is. MAXXI is, just in 2 words, MAXXI is the National Museum for Modern Art and Architecture and Design. It's not a museum. I shouldn't talk about it as a museum. It does also host exhibitions, but it's a really open platform for research. And I think we do a lot of political work in MAXXI, looking, thanks to our artistic director, Hanru, looking a lot at where art, and I touch on what you were just saying a second ago, where art is transforming communities. I mean, I'm not a critic, I'm not a curator, so this is not my job to say if, you know, but definitely I want to say that we are interested in looking at the process, maybe more than the outcome. We're very interested at looking at the creative processes and what the creative processes are producing in communities, on the field, on the territory. We feel that we have a role sort of an avant-poste on the Mediterranean and North African area, and that's why we're working a lot with these countries. But let me just end on this now. I mean, there is a lot to do in terms of reshaping mainstream institution. And we feel that we are a mainstream institution in a way. We are the national da-da-da-da-da-da. We have a lot of public money, not enough. And that's another problem. We don't have enough money. That's another European problem. Because the vision that regulated Europe throughout the last, what, 10 years maybe? At least 7. Was totally disinvesting from culture. So the idea that culture costed, I don't know if you say this, but anyway, it costed too much money. And I think that what we're getting back is that Europe without culture costs more in terms of you know, cohesion, etc., etc. I do see a role for culture, not only arts, I mean culture in broader way. And I think this role has very much been neglected by a political vision, a very clear political vision. And I don't see the anti-European movement from the left, from the right, tackling this issue at all. In terms of, you know, where's the budget? How much money? How is it used? What is the budget, the European budget and the national budget financing? So going back to MAXXI, we do have some public money. We have to match funds with private money. And we try and get money for those projects that we feel are relevant in terms of the transformational content that they have on a more general level. Thank you.
Great. Okay, loads to come back to again. But Antonis, now you said you didn't want to kind of speak, but just
yeah, well,
a few thoughts. Yeah, you've got this.
Well, especially after this introduction, my God, I feel really this Atlas feeling. It's difficult to really make or take a position at this moment. I think a lot of things have been already said with introduction talks, and I think, and I assume you understand this weight that comes actually to artists and the artist practice. And there's all expectations that come around it. It's maybe one of the most problematic things that we can talk a bit later. This kind of attitude, or let's say need, that I can understand, or it's a need that from society it comes itself. But at the same time, what really defines, what we actually ask for the artist is quite a big question. I mean, on one hand, you said that critical or not critical, critical enough or critical at all, or reflecting or not reflecting. I think there are all these notions that kind of, in the times of turbulence, it becomes even more unfocused. And we more or less we had this discussion a little bit in the dinner, and actually would like to maybe add something later on. At this point, I'm kind of digesting all these levels and layers of the discussion.
Okay, just to kind of deal initially, just very quickly, I think, with the funding issue, which was kind of raised, but also which you were talking about advocacy. I know that's not just funding. Because one of the things which, I mean, this is a kind of well-rehearsed argument, so I don't want to overdo it, but one of the things that has happened is that those people who want to advocate for the arts in relation to funding feel under pressure, which is slightly different than the artist pressure, but artists sometimes feel it, to prove their social worth, you know, to kind of prove their usefulness. You know, we aren't just a luxury. You know, if you don't have us, you don't have cohesion, you don't have, you know, and you'll know, or those of you who are familiar with the debate over the last 15, 20 years in the UK, it is beyond caricature in terms of, you know, politicians saying arts have got to solve the problems of teenage pregnancy, HIV, unemployment, the economy, UK PLC, everything and anything, and the arts get very squeezed. But that's, but even at the level of just, is there a danger of defensiveness in relation to advocating for the arts to the politicians who might be Philistine, and then trying to appeal to them by using politics to kind of get into the coffers of the money, right? And is that a problem or a tension?
I think one of the things that we've managed to fail at is we keep ourselves in a very closed arts and culture box. So we talk about, we advocate for, and we push for, and looking at the only financial consideration, a particular budget that is defined as culture. So I will always defend that there should be public sector money supporting culture. What there needs to be is a policy thinking and decision about what aspect does the political support, not political, sorry, the public support, what aspect can it connect to? And maybe it should connect to the things that most are less able to find any resources anywhere else, are more available to a broader public, are looking at that research element where the starting points can go on forever just about where it is. But I believe public sector funding needs to be there in balance with, because I'm not saying it's necessarily partnership, but in balance with investment resources that come from other places. But I think we've failed ourselves in advocating only within a cultural conversation and then trying to say, going back to the instrumentalizing, well, culture, arts and culture can do X, Y, and Z. What I would hope we would do is change the discourse to what is the equal value, if we can look at a metaphoric table that is looking at our societal concerns and issues, and you have an economic perspective, you have an environmental perspective, a societal perspective, you should have a cultural one that is an equal voice. And that's on opinion making and perspective as much as anything else. And sometimes you use a really simple analogy of when there is an important news item, when there's an important contemporary issue, there are leaders in various fields that were asked to comment on it. There is rarely an artist or someone from the cultural sector that's asked to comment on or have an opinion on anything other than an arts and culture issue. So we need to embed the advocacy more broadly rather than trying to switch the advocacy, because we've had years and years of saying, well, culture has an economic benefit, arts has an economic benefit, has a tourism benefit. Now we're right in the midst of the societal one. I believe culture has a huge contribution to make to society, but as an equal player, not as something that is funded to support something else.
Okay, I think that explains, and I think it has moved on. I think you're right that that's certainly that discussion. Is there anything you wanted to add to that? Just
well.
I'm coming out to the audience in a minute.
Okay, if I look at my country, which, by the way, also had to negotiate with the Troika, if I look at my country and I look at public expenditure for culture, it's just like gone down like that. In fact, this is a reason for me of some kind of pride. I was the culture minister in 2001 that brought our budget to its highest level ever, and then from that it started decreasing. It was 3 billion euros at the time on a national base, and then we had local, obviously. It's now 1.2, so it's nothing. And it was already nothing when it was high. And we should have had other 20 years of increasing. But said that, I really do think that what we need to rethink is that culture is generating wealth. I mean, different kind of wealth. And the issue is, how do we measure wealth? And I think there's a huge issue. I work on these issues with my Human Foundation you mentioned before. I mean, we cannot just measure wealth with the growth of income. And there's a huge issue connected to what indicators do we want to use. That's a very important issue in Europe as well. For example, to measure programs, to measure the European projects. What kind of output do they have? What is the wealth that they produce? And I think it's about time to totally reverse the paradigm. It's not questing for money. It's proving that €1 spent on culture produces 10 in terms of social return on investment.
But Giovanna, can I just interrupt? I mean, I'm not kidding. I mean, everybody involved in the arts in Britain spends all its life measuring.
Britain has so much money. I mean, look, you're talking from a country. You're talking from a country.
Yeah, it's not more civilized, let me point out. Can you imagine? That's what I'm saying. Loads of money invested in culture.
But it's very market-oriented, your country, in terms of how it spends its money for arts. I mean, just to be brutal, because you asked us to be.
I'm not going to defend Britain. It's all right.
That's right. That's right. And I'm going to.
Really worried
I'm going to defend Europe. You see, because I think that you come from a country that has spent. I don't know. I mean, I don't know the exact figure now, but it's been my friend Chris Smith when I was in minister, and he was my sort of counterpart. He was. I would say this in front of him, obviously. He was lobbying for European money, but he didn't really care. I mean, you had so much from lottery money, from private banks, from Barclays, from private institutions, and that's a model, and it's a model that works. I mean, we're looking at it now to think how we can have private money get into the art scene and the culture scene in an approach which resembles the UK Anglo-Saxon approach. But this is not Europe.
But Giovanna, I was making the opposite point, which was I was saying that the irony is that many of, and not everybody, and probably not Chris Smith, but he's a government minister, many people in the arts feel that what's happened over the last 20 years has been entirely destructive to the arts, because it's all been about measuring and proving worth in non-artistic directions. So there's been lots of money thrown at it because they promised to do all these non-artistic things, which of course, now that there's a recession, by the way, local councils are saying, well, you said you were going to solve the problem of mental illness, but we'd rather choose the psychiatric ward instead of you, which is a reasonable choice if that's the basis on which you've argued for your orchestra. And this is, I'm not making it up. I mean, this is genuinely what's happened. So they spend lots of money, but also, you just said about proving worth. I mean, there's so much time and energy in arts organisations in measuring and proving worth in Britain that you've got no time to be an artist. So we're drowning in arts administrators counting. I mean, I don't think that's creative.
I don't see that happening in my country.
No, but it's just that you were saying we should emulate and go down that route. I'm saying, please don't.
I'm not saying that. No, I'm not saying that at all. I think we have to look for another pattern, which is a much more public-private pattern. And I think what we're trying to do as at MAXXI, for example, is to, we don't want to be like Tate. No, we don't want to be like Tate. We want to be something else. And we want to be much more open to what is happening, in places where art is in fact driving, for example, people, to rewrite their community connections, for example.
Can I just add, Antonis, just on terms of artistic practice, I mean, one thing that, I mean, without wishing to make a virtue of poverty, which would be wrong, completely, of course, but it's just the one thing I have noticed is that in those places where I know people are really struggling in terms of money, that there has actually been still a lot of artistic creation. So I'm not, there's always a danger of sounding as though you're romanticizing kind of the artist in the garret starving. But it's just that
fits to the image.
Yeah, but in the turbulent times, there has actually been maybe not surprising, but a flourishing in many ways of artistic creation. And just in terms of the exhibition, that's been one of its themes.
What is really wonderful, I mean, art, you know, if we even talk about, I mean, what we just talk until now, I mean, can survive by itself. And we can go for measurements, or we can talk about fundings and how actually you're gathering all this public money to invest to the art. Art can survive as it is. I mean, it's something organic. Oscar Jon is a famous painter from Cobra movement. He was saying that art, we should not, the mistake that maybe we're doing is that we try to define art as a structure, as a measurement, and he says that art should just be a natural thing. It's like, you know, I walk, I drink, I eat, and I'm making work, and I'm making art. So I think it's just fundamental differences how we are approaching. And then, of course, we can think that we over-fantasize on the ideal, this ideal of whatever it's beauty or critique. And all those things maybe makes what is art, obviously. It's this puzzle of all these different interpretations, needs. And always I become really kind of allergic to the approach of how people are approaching the arts as the thing, the special. Art, I mean, I'm an artist, I have a mother like you do, a father like you do. I come in from this society, like you live. So I'm reflecting. I do probably have certain sensitivities that kick my ass to do something with it. And then I can completely understand that part. And that's, I think, that's the difference, is that I'm standing for these sensitivities. I stand up and I say, I'm here. The rest of I know these, I mean, I joined this argument, and I'm very, very familiar with one from Greece that I'm coming from, but also the other one that I live, and it's in Netherlands. So I live in these two schizophrenic situations. And that's also, in a way, makes me also very emotional in terms to really articulate clearly, as you do, and obviously you have a big experience. It's to, first of all, I'm emotional because I'm Greek. So I do come from a country that have been in the last 5 years in, I mean, well-known circumstances. You understand what I'm talking about. But at the same time, I'm not living there. So I live in Netherlands. So I'm considering for the Greek point of view as the lucky one, the one that you can have a distance. And it's true that it's a choice that I do, even with my work, it's to keeping this kind of distance and become more observing a situation rather be completely involved. And in the same time, what I want to say before is, because I'm very pragmatic, I'm sorry, it's my brain, connected with Netherlands. In Netherlands, we had these cuts in the culture. And it was the culture became like it was like a revenge. It was a revenge. The populistic party was mentioned as an intellectual hobby for the intellectuals. So, and then became kind of dramatical cuts that came to the country that changed completely the perception, because you know that the thing is, for many years in Netherlands have been institutionalized. Artists have been very much institutionalized. They learned to work on a form that's similar with the idea how you're gathering money, for example. You know, like you had to learn how to apply to certain foundations. And many times I have to say that half of my life, my artistic life, it's about being a secretary. I have to write tons of reports or apply to all the foundations possible to make my work visible. So, and it's interesting that although I don't have a foundation to hold on, both of you, the three of you actually, you do have a foundation to hold on and make the argument. I have to become my own, let's say, foundation to hold on. It becomes very tricky, kind of unbalanced. Yeah.
Okay, look, that actually was very useful because you reflected on a lot of things. Right, audience, we're just having a conversation now. So it's not a Q&A, so it's just like, does anyone want to speak? And I'm going to take 3 or 4 people, and then we'll see if anyone wants to respond to anything. And you're not to be shy. That is not allowed.
Oh, I'm more nervous, I think, than they are.
Who would like to kick us off? Okay. I'll cheat by taking you, Luca, but I genuinely, conversations, I can't believe that you can't agree with all of us because we don't agree with each other. Therefore, on the basis that you will have opinions, or let me encourage you, while Luca's speaking, be brave and think aloud. Think aloud, so it can be uncertain, hesitant, and you're not sure, and you're prepared to say something that doesn't make any sense. Oh, there you go. Brave on it.
Sorry, so I'm Sue from London, and I just wanted to make the point that wasn't it true that artists and poets supported the First World War? And we look nowadays to artists to cohere communities and to do all lovely touchy-feely things. But actually, artists haven't always supported communities. Artists were the first group of people to say, yeah, let's go for it. Let's go for this war. Because their societies at the time were seen as boring. And the First World War, was seen as excitement. And so some of the best British poets in the last couple of 100 years have been the pro-war, bizarrely enough, pro-war poets of 1914.
Thank you. Nice countercultural point there. Luca, right, anything like that?
And the Italian futurists, by the way, who I thought were fantastic.
Obviously, I was thinking of the Italian futurist movement.
Okay, Luca.
Some were against it, but some were pro.
Yeah.
I mean...
But in other words, they had different political views.
They had different visions.
Yeah. Sorry. It's all right, I'll come back. Yeah. You and then...
No, the lady. I was breaking the eye, so I can do my own one. Someone else.
I know, but while everyone else is waiting to think about the ice, you carry on. Come on, everyone.
I have a couple. I mean, it's 25 questions. Just I'll restrain to a few of the issues. One, I think that is a really multi-layer discourse where we're just jumping from one to the other one, and that probably there is a need of somehow clarity. One issue is why and what there should be a policy towards has to do with the arts, it's the expression of people. There's another one, which is what's the role or the relationship between the people and the artistic experience, whatever it is. And here I see the reason of a policy. And the third one is a question to you, because you say something which it touches me so let it question me. You say, there's a lot of pressure on artists. But then we're kind of denying the role of artists. So in your own perspective, what you are, and what kind of recognition you expect, no? To have in relation to the way you see you are. So I mean, I'm a doctor in society, and I expect somehow to be recognized as a doctor because I'm doing something. No? I'm a baker. I have a problem with my job because I don't know what to do. So go back to the policy and the arts in society. I think that I'd like to see it this way. What really is relevant, not in the arts, but is in the relationship between the people and the artistic experiences, is that this is one of the few experiences in human life which reaches you at the level of the emotion and the imagination. And through that, you go back to rationality. In our Western world, this is a very strong thing. It's pretty unusual. Why I think there should be a strong policy for? Because the relationship between, we as ordinary people and and the act, no, of him, and why is important the participation and looking for the process, is exactly that through certain way of doing arts, I as individual and I as a collectivity, I can develop certain skills, certain capacity to read reality, which enable me to be a citizen. What I means, I made an example. We have been grown up, think to education system, okay? The objective of the education system was competitiveness, so building people for a market, labor market. Under a certain angle, our society, to be better, probably be better in the direction which we all agree here, even we have different visions, we need to have people more cooperative. We should invest in social innovation more than technological innovation, probably. And these require skills, which goes under the word of empathy, under the word of curiosity, under the word of cooperation. And these are skills, I mean, the word skill doesn't apply, but I don't know the exact word, how to express this. These are capacity which you can enforce by living an expressive, an artistic expression, no matter of the message of the expression, but it's the participation to the process. And just I have to...
yeah, okay, right, good. I was about to say something. Good. That gentleman there, put his hand up. So respond to each other, and then I'll start seeing whether anyone wants to come back at the front. You have to wait for the mic, yeah. Cheers.
My name is Jan. I live here in Brussels. I'm not going to respond to the gentleman as requested. I'm just the third person that you asked to speak up. I mean, I deal with cultural policy making all the time, so that's something that I'm not so interested in. I actually came because the note said it's about arts and creation in a time of crisis, and I was wondering why we're not talking about this crisis a little more. In the introduction, there was a mentioning of, you know, we live in a time of turbulence, but I'm much more interested in what these turbulent times are, what the crisis is, and how it impacts on artists and on society in general. And I think all the policy questions actually follow that. So I'd be much more interested in, you know, what do you think about the impacts of the economic recession on the arts, on society? What does it mean when people don't have any means to live an ordinary life anymore? Nobody has mentioned the, you know, amazing impacts and terrible impacts that technology is having on society at the moment. So I feel I'm a little bit disappointed because I feel the debate is going not in the direction that I'm actually really intrigued by at the moment.
Okay, well that's okay because you've indicated what way you'd like it to go. But just in terms of the things which you think are creating the most turbulence, because the setup of today's debate was the turbulence in relation to Europe, which actually has been on the discussion, but it is quite a contentious issue. But anyway, in terms of the economic crisis, I mean, do you think it's that, or then, as you rightly point out, there are people who will say there are other things that are more turbulent, like the digital revolution, you know?
I think it's actually all, it's probably all completely interconnected, of course. I feel, I mean, I look at the world in maze, and when the kind of art that intrigues me most these days is actually that is a bit more research-driven and inquires a lot. I'm not looking for political statements. I'm interested in discovery, I guess. You know, those kind of things I'd be interested in to hear about more.
Okay, great. Well, anyone can pick that up, and I'll see. Yeah, go on. Why don't you start? Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, I will try. First of all, I want to answer your question. I do not know, I'm not very clear always what's my ambitions. For sure, is to be able to articulate, and I do feel the responsibility of going public, and I do understand since you're getting this attention, you have to carry this responsibility. And first of all, obviously, I need to satisfy myself as a, you know, and at the same time, I need, and I'm desperate to communicate with the others. So that's exactly the, let's say, the ingredients. Before you talk about something about the innovating and the process of making, a few months ago it was a Malevich exhibition in Amsterdam. And I will quote something from Malevich. He was actually, it's out of record, more or less almost an anecdote. Malevich visited Bauhaus, somewhere in the end of the times of Bauhaus. And I think he had a meeting with Paul Klee. And then he said, because he was making these maquettes, he's really famous for making these architectural, utopic gestures. And he was defending the fact that they didn't have a function. And I love that part. I love that part, that I defend myself to don't have a function. I do want to stand for this. And then, yes, I completely share partly of your disappointment, but the turbulence is also interesting because it's not only that affects the arts and the artistic practice, but also the politics around it. And partly was a lot of political debate here that quite influence. So we discuss about a new landscape. I think we have to really understand that we are in a new landscape. And I'm not talking metaphorically speaking, we even physically. Let's go really physically, how much influence. I live in a country that extends into the sea like this. Reforms, the landscape on the coast changing, everything changing. We are in this kind of tornado or turbulence, if you say. So we try on this exactly movement to point out things and make statements. It's almost impossible. So I think it's a revolution that we can do that, even for a second, if we can just stop and say, hello, it's this one. So to define, that's also what fascinates me a lot. And in this case, I said more also concerning also the Greek society, and especially into the arts. If you look in Greece, first of all, anyway, as a nation, it's quite. I always say it's a concept. It's not really a country. It's a concept. It's the realignment. The period, this romantic period in Europe, thought we have to have a free Greece. So they did that. So, and we are there, and we are standing there already 200 years now. But if you see also into the arts, try without necessarily me be a theorist. What happened? There were certain movements in Greece that happened, especially after the beginning of 20th century, and more or less in 20s and 30s, the modernistic movement. And afterwards, things have been more or less disappeared. There was a gap. And it's the first time, after all these years, within the crisis, that what happened is that suddenly the artist got orientation. And it's a weird thing to say. I don't say that I'm fan of the crisis, but it's interesting to see that suddenly have been forced by this turbulence. Probably they have been set to side to take a position. And that's the beauty. In this case, that creativity is still there, and even more. Some people think, they believe that I'm too optimistic, or because I'm not living there. But what I see, it's really that someone really, for the first time, started articulating in a certain direction that before, most of the times, was copy. Mostly the British state, British art scene, the damage that you did in the 90s. Sorry, that's my... and it's interesting to see that now they have been forced to take a position, and that's really fantastic, and maybe satisfy your needs, all the needs that we just before tried to, we talk about, or we said it. Yeah.
I think that's really interesting, but it actually reflects, ironically, the thing about the First World War poetry, because it is an irony, because, in British schools you're brought up with anti-war poets like Wilfred Owen, but actually the majority of the artistic classes were pro the First World War with some enthusiasm, because it represented a dynamic movement in a very kind of turn of the century, kind of stasis, and people kind of really went for it. And some of my favourite writers, people like Thomas Mann and so on, you think, kind of shockingly to kind of see their kind of gung-ho war enthusiasm. It didn't last, but it was there, and they were very, very pivotal. But in a way, the point about this turbulence is that things do happen, and it does happen to artists like anyone else. It can.
It's an energy.
It energizes in whichever, but it doesn't go in necessarily the way you'd think it would, always. But anyway, anything you want to pick up on from anything anyone said?
I think maybe just going back to the turbulence, and I know one of the things I was trying to flag is there's this turbulence is, for some and in some situations is much less extreme than in other ones, and how if we look at the question or the comment about how technology and digital shift has created an unease, a turbulence, that it could be more considered in a global way, but it also pops up in specific ways, in specific disciplines, in specific generations, in specific communities that might be isolated from, and also raises an incredible number of concerns because of the speed of change has not allowed any ethical or moral compass to stay with it. And how then art and culture functions within that, or functions is such a horrible word, but how it reacts is actually what has been said. It depends on the individual. I think one of the things a trap we fall into is looking at sort of institutionalized art and culture versus art and culture that is happening, is participatory, is engaging. Because institutions have a different kind of reaction to turbulent times, and it is generally a preservation of an institution. And so I think we do ourselves a disservice to lump things together, either the nature of the turbulence or the scale of the turbulence, and also the kind of reaction or response that there is, be it individual or institutional.
I think that's really true. I really agree with you, but I think it's very difficult, isn't it? Because there is a public discourse about the arts in these turbulent times, which means that people end up, well, not like me being asked to chair this meeting, but I've been asked to speak on arts and the recession and arts and politics panels. I mean, so many of them over the last 5 years, by everyone and anyone, that it makes me think everybody wants to have this conversation. So it's not as though artists are just being allowed to get on with it over there, or, you know, there is a formal discussion about this, and there are rehearsed narratives, and that, I mean, I'm not...
That are perhaps institutionally driven.
Yeah, possibly, yeah. It's hard to know where it's coming from, but you know it's there, and you must feel it. One thing I did want to ask you, it relates to Luca's question about, about process, but it's something you said, I'm just not sure myself. I mean, on the one hand, there's obviously something unique about the sensitivities of artists, without kind of over-privileging them, to use that horrible word. You know, some of the things you described would be true of science as well. Collaboration, working together, curiosity, imagination. I mean, you wouldn't get very far as a scientist if you didn't exhibit them. And I've never been able to, I mean, artistic genius is almost like, I can't even understand it. You just recognize it when you see it, and people are driven and so on. But that was what I was thinking when you were talking about the projects that you were talking about in Egypt, because I think it is very difficult to know what's driving those things. You know, is it arts? Is it an arts drive? Is it a kind of, there's nothing wrong with being genuinely, humanely interested in what's happening in Egypt, and the mess that there is there. But I mean, when the arts projects get involved in those things, are they being driven, which bit's driving them? Do you see what I mean? I mean, is it the collaborate, humane, good bits, or is it the, as a mad artist, or not mad, but as an artist, I've got to create this thing, or is it not?
The voice. I think it's a combination. I mean, one of the things I mentioned was going back to the example in Cairo or in other cities across North Africa, is that the cultural space, the few that there were that are independent, was the only safe space that was apolitical for people to gather in. So this in itself became an artistic act by the engagement of the artists and the cultural organizations. But there was not, and is only growing true civil society engagement if we talk about art as in institutions and art as independent. And in the countries that we're in, we're very fortunate to have an active civil society, or the potential of an active civil society, where if you compare that to other situations, that there isn't. And this is what is developing in a lot of these very extremely turbulent situations, the ability for civil society organizations that are cultural organizations and social organizations to actually grow and have a voice and be those spaces.
Can I say something?
Yes, of course, yeah. I was going to say, and then if you say something, and then if people could be thinking what else they want to say.
No, I wanted to go back to the man down there and about the turbulence issue, how we're looking at this word. I mean, I really want to sort of defocus on the political and institutional side of turbulence, because that's not the only side. There's obviously an economic, a social, and I think there's also a spiritual side to it. I mean, there's, I mean, I want to make this, I'm exaggerating, but after all, if we look at it, I mean, what was the real click? What was the cause of the financial crack? It was greed, and it was this incredible sort of egoic structure that has been acknowledged as the normal structure of our societies. And on top of that comes everything else. So what I see in the art, and I don't know if an artist does, you know, something because he's, you know, as you were saying, humanitarian, he's driven by a social issue, or because he's mad or whatever. I don't care. What is interesting for me to look at is that in this turbulence, which is, as I say, a psychological, spiritual, human turbulence, and on top of that, it's an economic, social, civic turbulence, and European turbulence. Ecological, thank you, absolutely. It's a whole paradigm which is exploding. It's a whole paradigm that's not, you know, resisting anymore. So we're looking for a new paradigm, and what I think is very interesting, and I totally agree with the man down there, and what I personally, on a personal level, find more interesting in arts is that here and there, not always, but I feel that there's a search. There's a search for an antidote to that very deep turbulence. And this search is our century's search. It is true what you were saying before, that we had times where artists and the cultural world and intellectuals in my country, very much so, thought that that search for a new world could go through war. Probably this is one of the things that Europe has done to us. I mean, well, I mean, Ukraine, but we are sort of acknowledged to the fact that war is not going to be the solution anymore. And this is, you know, 50 or 50 over years of peace in Europe has done that to us on a genetic role, probably. Nobody can think now. I mean, I don't know an artist that would think that war is the solution to the turbulence. Maybe I'm wrong. Yes, you're right. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. But anyway, what I find extremely interesting is that there's a search on the level of where is the new paradigm. And sometimes, not always, artists can give us an experience of that. And I also want to say one last word on what Luca was saying. For me, as an institution, rethinking our role, we have an advantage because we're new. MAXXI just has 3 years of, you know, so we don't sort of have to conserve something that was there before. We can really reshape ourselves in the turbulence, and that's what we're trying to do. But I really feel, and I quarrel every day on this issue, because many curators, many artists, but definitely many curators, you know, those sort of very, how do I say, chiara fama, famous directors, curators. You know, it's an elite. It's a world elite around the world. They really don't care very much about the experience that the public is exposed to. They don't care very much about that. I know I'm being radical in this. I mean, it's what? It's old-fashioned. It's old-fashioned, no? To think my role is to offer and expose, that was your word, expose to a cultural experience and to a transforming experience, maybe, people. And I think that's what culture is for. So it's not a pedagogical approach, but it's neither an elitist approach. It's something that has to do with the encounter between the artist and the public and what it can change in the experience. And I've personally, you know, witnessed so many times this elite, this curatorial elite around the world that really doesn't care. And I think this is awful.
Okay, thanks.
Not all, obviously.
No.
Not our director. Not Hanru. Okay.
It's interesting. We behave in a way like almost this, no offense, but like these old ladies that they have Alzheimer, and every time they tell them that they lost their husband, they're crying, and it's really a sad thing. They told them that she lost her husband. Every time she cries every time. So it's a really sad story indeed. But I mean, we have a history. And if we visit the period of 20s, you know, the Great Depression, it's really very famous and have been, the similarities are here too. And if you see the artistic production at this period too, it's amazing. It's really amazing. It's like the most iconic moments that we live now and we're analyzing as after almost 100 years. It's based on these kind of periods. So for me, what I really found interesting, and I kind of wrote it down like a small quotation, like we should revisit the new. The idea of the new, of modern times, the modernity, the old modernity period, and revisit it because we fail on the new. We live on the moments of failing the new that didn't really succeed. But we can go against of it, but it's interesting to just revisit it. Revisit exactly what you say, a little bit talking about Europe and the mistakes of the Europe. I grew up also as a kid pro-Europe. I mean, we have been on this kind of period in Greece, trying to find an identity again. It's talking about already before. And then the Europe became like the ideal. It became the utopia. This is the new utopia of our being. And partly, and for a period of our growth, of this fake growth that Greece had, based on this dream. And misused, abused, as always. You know, it's a slut. It's the same like going back to the arts. It's a slut. So she does everything. She can pleasure me, and I can abuse her, and I can love her. So it's what I really want to say simply is just what we need is to understand our past in a very clear and objective, as much we can be objective, because it's not about searching for history. History is not an objective tool, but it's a certain experience there that we can just redraw and understand what we can change and act. And act, obviously, because that's the main thing that's missing or lacking, is the idea that we became idiots. And idiots, and I don't say idiots as in idiots in the contemporary term, but there's idiots as individuals. In ancient Greece, idiots means the selfish, the individual. So that was exactly, the egocentric. And that's the mistake that we did. We just became idiots. And it's interesting to, and there's, I think, probably the answers on this kind of, yeah.
I mean, I think it was actually interesting. The guy said that he'd hoped that the discussion would be something that it's not, because for me, you know, it would be impossible to say what I think the problems of contemporary society are today. But that, broadly speaking, is my life's work. I mean, what I think is that we are overly glib about caricaturing and characterizing the contemporary period we live in. That's one of my great complaints. And we have easy solutions to problems which are far beyond the superficial. I mean, I actually don't think the financial crisis was created by greed, although greed is part of it. But you know, when it comes to the arts, the young British art market, you know, was on a par with the bankers, right? So, I mean, you know, just to kind of throw things, the confusion of what things are worth. But anyway, there's also a crisis of economic productivity that the bubble covered over. But there is an existential crisis going on the one hand throughout the world, but there is a deep political crisis going on in a world post-ideology. And there is undoubtedly a crisis of belief and a lack of a web of meaning. This all sounds rather huge, but it's true. And, you know, post the Cold War, nobody's worked out how their foreign politics might work. We're all conscious of, and this hasn't even emerged today, of a world in which we apparently say God is dead, we live in a secular society, but around the world there seems to be a God driving people to things that we can't, you know, inspiring people to put their life on the line. We all feel rather awkward as we say it, put their life on the line and put other people's on the line. They're prepared to fight for their religion, some people, etc., etc. These are very big questions, and my straightforward proposition is, that's true, and no doubt the arts will have something to say on it, but there's by no stretch of the imagination a way that arts can deal with all of that. And we can't also deal with that without reading a lot of books. That's what prompted me. I mean, not just understanding our history, but reading books on the economy, arguing politically, massive, massive, massive intellectual hard work and fights, and trying to work out and taking control of our own destiny. It's certainly not a policy issue. And I simply think that is possible. The arts won't do it, but hopefully artists will feel wanting to be part of that process as well. But that's why I think it's almost an impossible, I mean, it's not about this meeting. I'm more making the point that I think everybody's trying to find a quick answer. I just don't think there is one. In the end, it's bloody hard work.
Sorry, Claire, you said a little bit before about autonomy, and I want to go back to this, the notion of autonomy. In a very short way, Cornelius Castoriadis, he was talking about autonomy and democracy. And it's interesting to just define, you know, as a Greek, I like always this kind of analyzing the word itself, you know, like one thing, it's autonomy, and which means I, myself, and the other means nomos, and which means law. So that's interesting that we talk about this kind of moral position, you know, someone, you know, of the law. The law that, I mean, we live in a constructive societies, we live next to each other, we are gathering in the cities, so it makes sense that we have to live in a certain, we need some basic structure, not on the bureaucratic sake, because that's the problematic thing, goes back to Europe, but into the idea of how morally we are mature enough to accept the responsibility. It's a certain responsibility that we need to take, and this goes to the artists, of course, and the art practice automatically. And then I think the autonomy is such an important issue, notion, that we should just, I mean, that's what I believe that we need to provide, this idea of the freedom with responsibility, with a certain responsibility that everyone carries. And then probably we're going to have engaged artists, or we do have engaged artists. And I think that's probably what could be the answer, let's say, from artists and practice and the moments of turbulence. Because it's this highly moment of conscience that's necessary. And generosity, and, you know, et cetera, this kind of interconnected. Yeah, sorry.
Can I invite you all to come to MAXXI in October? Because we are experimenting something which may be of some interest and somehow follows on this conversation. What Hanru is doing in October, he's totally emptying the space. And he's reinstalling it with only sound installations. And we are conceiving MAXXI for 2 months, and I totally agree with you on the fact that we need very strong intellectual work connected with this. So we are conceiving MAXXI for 2 months as a public place where we are going to host discussions, very tough discussions, connected with this installations. It will be only sound, and it will be the sounds of democracy, nature, revolution, cities, urban spaces, families, love, and so on. And we will be offering, connecting with artists' work, which is their work, an intellectual, in-depth work on these issues. So this is just to end up with an invitation.
A bit free advertising. Right, anyway, we're on the last, 10 minutes or so. So there's lots of people here who want to speak and have got their hand up. Don't regret it afterwards. That gentleman there.
Okay, so ça fonctionne? Okay. I would like to go back to the title of this discussion. And it was a role of creation in times of turbulence. I'm running an organization supporting creatives in Belgium. So we see them daily on the floor. And my impression is that that people create because they have decided to. They do that sometimes thanks to public support, sometimes despite the lack of it. And what is really interesting is that creation is not totally, but in a large measure, insensitive to the crisis. People do with what they have. And so there is probably no role of creativity in times of turbulence. There is a creativity because people have decided to create. And in time, in 10 years, 20 years, sometimes much more time is needed to analyze what was created and what it meant. But we should not try to reverse the discussion on creativity. Creativity is, and probably has no role. But what I see is that people creating are in a kind of laboratory of society. And what I see, and I find it encouraging and joyful, people feel good when creating when they are in a collaborative, cooperative environment, which is, for me, the best sign for the future of our society.
Okay, very interesting.
Historical perspective, the sponsor for the arts was not always a democratic government. It was, at some point, a religious institution, the church for Europe, and the art was religious. And then it could be the kings, the queens, and the art was here to prove that they were majestic. And nowadays, it's, for the countries we're talking about, it's a democratic, supposedly democratic government. And so we also need to relate the today's creation and today's artists with who is the sponsor and where does the money come from. It always happens. And when you say that you should not say that art is here to cure social problems, the reason why today we ask ourselves this is because who's the sponsor? But we also have artists who don't work for that, but they work for millionaires or for big art galleries, and they also have different points of interest. Nevertheless, there's always something that remains, and we can still relate with the art from the Middle Ages in some point, and to the art from Renaissance and all these different periods of time. So maybe the role of creation is that they it has something to do with this creativity that happens no matter what, with the fact that artists are also individuals who decide to speak up, whatever the condition, whatever the environment, who decide to speak up and say something to others, to communities. So maybe the role of creation is to contribute and make the best of it. It is always an environment where the money is important, and you've had always more artists in a wealthy country than in a poor country. So, but the role of creation could be this, that in maybe not with immediate understanding of what it's been doing, but it contributes to make the best out of it. Just a thought.
No, I think that's a really good point, and I think that it does complicate the picture because, or it complicates my picture from what I was saying earlier. You're right, but I think one of the things is that great art transcends its funding. And one of the things that we also haven't necessarily talked about tonight is what makes great art. I mean, we haven't talked about more things than we have talked about, fairly obviously. But that's also, I think, sometimes the confusion about how you gauge things. I would like to be able to hold art to account to itself, you know, within its own terms as great art or as shoddy. I mean, you know, not all art is great. Some things you see that are produced and created with the best intentions and with the politics I agree with are terrible artistic creations, and some things whose impetus might not be of my taste as art move me enormously, and I think that's where the muddle can lie. So I think that was useful to remind ourselves that those works were created sometimes for the hagiography or funded by and have to reflect the church and who's paying for it, but in the end their artistic merit is something that we don't care, you know, who cares whether that sacred music was written for God? For me, it changes my life every time I listen to it, you know, every time I hear it. Well, not all of it, you see what I mean. Okay, final thoughts? I mean, questions? Angry? Oh, sorry, I didn't see you, sorry.
It's just that speaking with Antonis, I remember that I come from Bucharest, and that actually in some parts of Europe, the turbulence started 25 years ago, and we're still looking for a model, and it's still not there. And it's wonderful that now we can share this search, but also that there are, it's because there is a completely change of model of financing for culture, of course. But and it was just to say this, and also to think about a Romanian artist that it's quite involved in highlighting what's happening in the world. And his name is Dan Perzowski, and he had an award from European Cultural Foundation and support. And I think they are there, and they do their contribution. And I think we forgot to say that this in our discussion. That was that.
Okay, thank you. Any last thoughts like that? Anyone want to share anything? Okay. I'm sure that we'll informally exchange views afterwards. I'm going to pass it along, and just any final thoughts you've got for the audience.
Yeah, maybe picking up on the Dan Perzowski comment, because this year that same award went to Teatro Valle Occupado in Rome and Theodor Tchaikovsky in Zagreb. And one of the major questions I heard, or comments, criticisms, unhappiness was, what has that got to do with culture? What has that got to do with art? So I go back to something I had said earlier. We put ourselves in boxes, and maybe back to one of Luca's comments. For me, it's a participation is so key, and it's the participation of the artist. I mean, the artist making. It's the experience that you have had with the art, and it's the experience that a community might have if they are collectively participating in that or collectively creating, collectively feeling an ownership, and the ability that that is to, that it brings in terms of transformation, as you said. And I think we have to see it all in all of its flaws and all of its imperfections. But I answered those concerns, or tried to answer those concerns about what is it, where's the art or where's the culture, in really going in and saying, well, this is a cultural, artistic spirit, an individual that is engaged with their community, in their society, in a range of things that are maybe not about the art specifically, but they see themselves as a key and active player and contributor to that community and that society.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, just a final thought. I mean, art in the time of turbulence is turbulent, and I think it passes the way it's been financed, but I think it also, in fact, we haven't talked at all about what a lot of artists work with today. We just saw this very beautiful show, in fact, not a land for, no country for young men, and many of those pieces of art were videos, and you know, in a time of turbulence, we have such a different set of problems in terms of conservation. I mean, we can now, you know, avoid thinking that Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel because of the Pope's financing it, but you know, we have very different problems now with how we conserve and how we keep the memory of contemporary art. So that's another big problem, and I think there are really no straight answers, and we just have to keep on searching and keep on being open to the experience of producing art, and probably more open to the process than to the projects.
Okay, thanks.
Well, I don't know if I have something to add. The only thing that what really scares me the most is as long we are staying and remain hypocritical to these kind of subjects. That's the main fear that I have. It's what concerns me the most, this kind of apathy, you know, like pathetic, like a passiveness that you see and grow so much in the society. It's interesting, all this critique to the critique, institutional critique. I mean, it's a studies, it's official studies. We know by now, but what really scares me the most is, like, for example, as you see now, how this almost colonial, unfortunately, we have to accept that Europe have these colonial roots, and the way that we're looking at things, I think is really dangerous. And before it was Greece, later it was Egypt, now it's Kiev, and so on and so on and so on. And I think that's a very dangerous way of understanding and listening to someone only because he's just too loud at the moment of silence. And that's something that we have to think.
I was on it. My final thought, slightly pessimistically, was I became friends with and was on a panel with some young Egyptian filmmakers at a documentary festival in which we were celebrating the democratic flowering of the Arab Spring. They are now on opposite sides of a vicious civil war, with the progressives having supported a military coup, and the other side, the losing side of that civil war, who were secular, now self-identifying as Muslims because of what's happened to the Muslim Brotherhood, which was a bit depressing. But they considered themselves to be artists who were active in a revolution, and politics threw them into the complexities of it not being as simple as any of us would have wanted. And I only say that because whatever about living in turbulent times, we live in serious times, and serious times require that we take ourselves seriously and don't try and avoid the hard work that comes from trying to understand the world with a view to changing it, to paraphrase one of my heroes. I think that our hosts have been very brave in having this. I don't care what anyone says, it's not like the usual arts politics debate you have. And it might not have quite fulfilled every single wish, but it's at least tried to be different. And I think that's admirable and undoubtedly insufficient, but, well, because it can't solve the problems of the world or of the arts. But I hope that you found it as stimulating as I did. I'd really, really like to thank the panel for putting up with me and my provocations, and also for being frank and open and honest and not spinning a line. You know, didn't come here with set speeches, but actually try to get to grips with the problem, which I think is half the issue. You've been invited to MAXXI in October. We have our Battle of Ideas Festival at the Barbican in October too, so you can check it out. But at which we're discussing the crisis of judgment, you know, and the moral vacuum. Right, that's a kind of big issue over 80 debates. But I hope what I was going to say was, whether you're at MAXXI or you're at the Barbican with the Institute of Ideas or wherever you are, I really do think that we should carry on having this kind of conversation internationally. Whether you're in or out of the EU, I think there should be a European conversation. We've got a huge amount to learn from each other, and we shouldn't be frightened of arguing with each other. I mean, arguing with each other is actually showing respect for each other, because we think we'll cope. We think we're grown up enough to say, I disagree with you, rather than patronisingly saying, oh, what a wonderful point you made. So here's to many more fruitful arguments at BOZAR and throughout Europe, and can we thank our panel very much, and for our hosts as well. Thank you.
Just a thank you to tell you that there will be a follow-up under the Italian presidencies. What it will be about, we don't know, but it will go along this line of talking, thinking, and the more we can make it tough, the better we will feel. Let's see. However, thanks a lot for having collaborated with us in... After the elections, right? After the election, yes, sure. So we're gonna... Thanks, and good night. And thank you to BOZAR, by the way.